In 1937, Carl Jung traveled to India and refused to meet the man considered its greatest living sage. Jung had spent 40 years mapping what he called the collective unconscious, a layer of the psyche deeper than personal memory, shared by all of humanity. And the deeper he looked, the less central the individual appeared to be. In India, he came close enough to visit Ramana Maharshi, considered by many the most profoundly realized spiritual teacher of the era. He chose not to go. He later wrote in his memory, "I felt that I was not in the right state to approach such a man." He never fully explained what he meant. In the Mandukya Upanishad, written over 2,000 years earlier, a remarkably similar structure already had a name. Not the collective unconscious. Brahman, an impersonal ground of awareness, not located in any individual mind from which all individual consciousness arises. Jung described an impersonal layer of psyche. The Upanishads described an impersonal ground of reality. Whether those point to the same thing remains debated. This video maps both investigations, and a third, which arrives at the same question from a completely different direction. Carl Jung developed the concept of the collective unconscious through 4 decades of clinical work. It was not a philosophical proposition, it was a clinical observation. Jung noticed a pattern across his patients that could not be explained by personal history alone. Patients who had never read mythology produced mythological imagery in their dreams. Patients who had never studied alchemy produced alchemical symbolism in psychosis. Similar images and narrative patterns appeared across cultures and historical periods. Jung became increasingly troubled by the implication. If the same imagery was appearing across patients who had never encountered it, the source was not personal. It was shared. He proposed that beneath the personal unconscious, the layer of repressed personal memories and complexes, there is a deeper layer. Not personal, not derived from individual experience, inherited, shared, universal. He called this layer the collective unconscious. Its patterns, archetypes, appear in the myths, dreams, and religious imagery of every culture. Not metaphors, clinical observations from 4 decades of documented case material. The deepest archetype in Jung's system is the self, capital S. Not the ego, not the personal self. The totality of the conscious and unconscious psyche, the ground from which both arise. Jung called the process of recognizing this ground individuation. Not self-development, not becoming a stronger ego. The gradual recognition that the ego is not the center, the self is. In the winter of 1937 to 1938, Jung traveled to India. He received an honorary doctorate from the University of Calcutta. He visited Santiniketan, Madras, Mysore. He was close enough to visit Tiruvannamalai, where Ramana Maharshi lived. He chose not to go. He later suggested that he was not psychologically prepared for such an encounter. Beyond that, his reasons remain unclear. Before the ancient parallel, the mainstream objection must be stated clearly. The collective unconscious is a psychological construct. It was derived from clinical observation, not metaphysical investigation. It is not a measurable entity. Many psychologists and neuroscientists reject it entirely. They argue that similar dream imagery across cultures reflects shared human biology, not a literal shared field of consciousness. Jung himself insisted his work was empirical, not metaphysical. He was cautious about claiming the collective unconscious was identical to Brahman. This video does not make that claim. What it maps is a structural similarity, two independent descriptions of an impersonal ground deeper than the individual self. Different instruments, possibly similar territory. Before the Upanishads description, notice something directly for 20 seconds. Right now, there is a thought present, and there is awareness of that thought. The awareness was present before the thought arrived. It remains when the thought passes. What, exactly, is that awareness? Does it have your name? Does it have your personal history? That is where the Upanishads begin. The Mandukya Upanishad, dated by scholars to the early centuries of the Common Era, is the shortest of the major Upanishads, 12 verses. In those 12 verses, it describes the structure of consciousness through 4 states. The first state, waking, in Sanskrit, Vaishvanara, the conscious mind, the ego, the personal self navigating daily life. The second state, dreaming, in Sanskrit, Taijasa, personal imagery arising when the ego relaxes, the individual material of memory and association. The third state, deep sleep, in Sanskrit, prajna. Here, some interpreters see a possible parallel with Jung's collective unconscious. In prajna, the Mandukya describes, all personal content is no longer experienced. The ego is not present. The dreaming mind is not present. What remains is not nothing. It is bliss. It is undivided. It is the ground from which both waking and dreaming arise. Individual distinctions are no longer experienced. Impersonal ground remains. The fourth state is turiya, the witness, pure awareness present across all 3 states, waking, dreaming, deep sleep. It is not a state itself. It is the awareness in which all states arise. The Mandukya identifies turiya with Brahman, the universal, impersonal ground of all awareness. One possible comparison to Jung looks like this. Waking conscious ego, Vaishvanara, personal unconscious, Taijasa, the collective unconscious where personal content is absent and impersonal patterns emerge, prajna, the self, the totality of the psyche, turiya. This comparison has been drawn by several comparative philosophers. It is not established scholarship. It is a structural observation worth examining. The implication either way is the same. The deepest layer is not personal. The Chandogya Upanishad states this ground in the Mahavakya, the great saying, Tat Tvam Asi. You are that. The impersonal, universal ground, Brahman, may be the same as the deepest awareness present in you. Not your ego, not your personal unconscious, the witness. Jung's individuation, the gradual recognition that the ego is not the center. The Upanishad points in the same direction in 4 words. The Upanishads describe the collective ground from inside the contemplative tradition, direct investigation, deep practice. In 1950, Jung wrote the foreword to Richard Wilhelm's translation of the I Ching. He had studied the I Ching for decades. He called it the most sustained engagement with what he recognized as synchronicity, meaningful coincidence arising from the collective ground. The I Ching is a Taoist document, and the tradition that produced it described the collective ground differently from the Upanishads, not as consciousness, but as the principle from which all things arise and to which all things return. The Tao. The Tao Te Ching, attributed to Lao Tzu, dated by scholars to the 4th century BCE. The first line of the first chapter. The Tao that can be named is not the eternal Tao. The Tao is not an object. It cannot be grasped by the personal mind. The personal mind is one of its expressions. Chapter 16 of the Tao Te Ching, paraphrased from the D.C. Lao, translation. Return to the root. The root is stillness. Stillness is returning to one's destiny. Returning to one's destiny is eternal. Some readers may notice a resemblance to what Jung was attempting to describe psychologically, an impersonal ground that the personal mind does not generate but emerges from. And the Taoist practice of Wu Wei, non-forcing, non-interference, shares something with Jung's individuation. Both involve a reduced identification with egoic control, though they arise from very different traditions. Jung recognized striking parallels between Taoist insights and some of his own observations. His I Ching foreword makes this explicit. 40 years of clinical case material, 2,500 years of direct investigation. Jung called it the collective unconscious, an impersonal ground shared by all. The Mandukya called it prajna, the state in which personal distinctions are no longer experienced, and turiya, the witness in which all states arise. The Tao Te Ching called it the Tao, that which cannot be named by the personal mind because the personal mind arises from it. 3 investigations, 3 methods, 1 recurring pattern. Deeper than the personal, impersonal, universal, the ground from which the individual arises. Whether these 3 descriptions point to the same territory remains an open question. What is not open is the pattern itself. Jung spent 40 years mapping what he called the boundary between the personal and the collective. The Upanishads describe a method for recognizing what is on the other side of that boundary. Directly. Test this for 30 seconds, not as philosophy, as a direct observation. Right now, notice the awareness present. That awareness is aware of your thoughts. It is aware of your name. It is aware of your history. Now ask, does the awareness itself have a name? Does it have a personal history? Or is it simply present, without the contents that make you you? The Mandukya calls that boundary the edge of prajna and turiya. Jung called it the threshold between the personal unconscious and the collective. Neither is asking you to believe anything. Both invite direct examination. Carl Jung spent 40 years approaching the impersonal ground from the clinical side, through dreams, through myths, through the case material of decades of consultations in Kusnacht. The Upanishads approached it through direct investigation. The Tao Te Ching approached it through the absence of interference. Different directions. A structurally similar description. Ancient wisdom, quantum mystery, direct knowing. The next investigation asks what Jung found when the clinical map ran out and he had to look directly. It is on your screen now and in the description.